So it was with the old fiddlers. One or two sawed their way vigorously through Turkey in the Straw or the Arkansas Traveler, but most didn't. Most quavered. A local man named Bunyard won the contest, and Mr. Clarence's brother came in third. Mr. Clarence's fiddling I missed. I went across the street to get a Coke and stopped to listen to a vulgar woman of high community standing who was sitting in front of the platform in a pre-parked Cadillac. She was talking loudly about the Burton-Taylor romance. The gist of her remarks was that Elizabeth Taylor ought to be spayed, else the menfolk of the entire Western world would soon be reduced to a state of slavering idiocy. When I got back to the platform, Mr. Clarence was just coming down, and I asked him how he had done. "Pitiful," he said. "My arm was too stiff on that first piece. I got to talking and never took enough warm-ups." On the platform, Uncle John Murdoch of Rusk, Texas, was fiddling gallantly away at the Old Soldier's Joy. He had not taken enough warm-ups either, or perhaps had taken too many. He was 84 years old and had roses painted on his fiddle. Around lunchtime, the old fiddlers were replaced by the Light Crust Doughboys, a hillbilly band of some renown. I remembered hearing them on the radio in the late 40s. The personnel had probably changed, but as I remembered it, they sang good, energetic hillbilly, and I was prepared to like them. Their pink vests were something of a deterrent, however, and their humor, that is, don't go around with another man's wife unless you can go 2 rounds with her husband, was another. Their music moved steadily popward until it was nudging Glenn Miller, at which point I found that my nostalgia had been overridden. While the doughboys were whirling through Cimarron Roll On, I wandered off in search of authentic East Texans, and found one right away in the curious, friendly person of Colonel Colin Douglas. Colonel Douglas's black beard was easily the equal of Allen Ginsberg's, and went well with his short-topped California motorcycle boots. He was a local ranch owner and a traveled and experienced man. He had been in pictures in the 20s, he said, but had left them for the oil business at about the time Clark Gable did the opposite. In a few minutes the doughboys finished and abruptly yielded the platform to a politician, a now-forgotten gubernatorial candidate who had slipped in to take advantage of the free people. He had more force than the old fiddlers, but considerably less poignance. The world, he said, was divided into 2 warring ideologies, the freedom lovers and the atheists. That elemental distinction established, he went on to draw a subtle parallel between himself and Abraham Lincoln. His subtlety consisted in not mentioning the latter by name. He had been born in a 1-room cabin on the wrong side of the tracks, and as a boy had gone to school with cardboard in his shoes. He elaborated on that point for a while, shook a few hard-knuckled hands, eased himself into a white Cadillac, and vanished forever. A local group got the platform and managed to hold it a while, all of them singing as loudly as it is possible to sing through one's nose. Shortly, however, they were routed by the master of ceremonies, who announced that the young fiddlers' contest was about to begin. That meant that Texas Shorty was going to fiddle over the loudspeaker, a prospect that for me held small appeal. It was a hot afternoon, and I was half in the mood to go home, but when I stopped to gas up, a filling station man warned me against leaving too soon. He assured me that the real Fiddler's Day action had not yet begun. By nightfall, he said, there would be several thousand people around the square. There would be street dancing, whiskey drinking, and wild, wild women. I was impressed and said I'd hang around. To pass the time, I set out in search of Miss Zillah B. Elledge and her sister, 2 women of artistic bent who lived in the woods near Athens. For years, legend had it, they had lived in an old ex-mansion in the pines, keeping what house they kept in one room, and slowly stripping the others down and burning them for firewood. A year or so earlier, they had reportedly burned the last of the mansion, after which they moved into the chicken house. All I really knew about them was that Zillah B. had sent my friend John Graves a Christmas card with a red pepper tied to it, and a note saying, "This is good, eat it." That was enough to make a search seem worthwhile, but unhappily the search proved futile. Some whittlers at a little country grocery store informed me that the girls were off in Mexico and were not due back until frost. Disappointed, I drove to the nearby town of Corsicana and whiled away the afternoon in a second-run movie house. It was getting on toward the cool of the evening when I got back to Athens. The lawn and the streets were filling up with people, and the string band contest, my last and brightest hope, was just about to begin. I went up on the platform to study the contest list, and the lineup of bands looked impressive. The Fiddle Swingsters were to kick things off, followed more or less in order by such groups as the Texas Ramblers, the Shawnee Wranglers, the Texas Blue Eagles, and the Twilight Serenaders. I crept across the stage and squeezed into a corner on the south side. A big red snare drum sat on one side of me, and the 3 contest judges sat on the other. The judges were stalwart men indeed. All day they hardly left their chairs. One was fat and looked complacent, and the other 2 were thinner and looked vacant. Their judging methods seemed highly instinctive. None of them seemed to make the slightest effort to score performances, or even to keep track of who was performing. Yet winners were announced almost immediately. While I was sitting near them, a lady pressed herself against the chicken wire screen and asked Red Hayes, the nearest judge, if Texas Shorty was going to perform again. "He's awful good, ain't he?" the lady said. "Yes, ma'am," Red said. "He sure plays that fiddle." "Next time he comes on, ask him to play the Tennessee Waltz for me, will you? My sister's crippled with arthritis. She's been that way 10 years. We got her out here in the car, and that's her favorite song." "Lady, we can't take no requests," Red said. "I sure am sorry." "Oh, you don't have to take none," she assured him. "Just tell Shorty Mrs. Muldrow wanted him to play that for her sister. Shorty won't mind. I've known Shorty's mother since she was a girl. We sure are proud of him around here." About that time, the Texas Swingsters came on stage and began to plug in their numerous electric instruments. From the cut of their pink sequined vests, I supposed them to be the doughboy imitators, and got set to endure Tuxedo Junction on the Hawaiian guitar. Instead, they played 3 polkas, and the contest was off to a wailing start. Before the first polka died away, I ceased paying the musicians any mind. I sat and looked off the platform at the people. The filling station man had been right. The people were coming. The courthouse lawn was solid full, and the street in front of the courthouse was filled to the center esplanade and was packing tighter. Those farthest from the platform were still in the sunlight, but most of the crowd stood within the cool, widening shadow of the courthouse. Looking down on all those shifting faces, it was hard not to lapse into generalization. I was looking down not just on East Texas, but on the South. The people below me were Southern. They had more in common regionally with the people who might gather on the courthouse lawns of Georgia and Alabama than with the Texans who lived in Lubbock, San Antonio, or El Paso. East Texans are molded by the South, West Texans by the West, and the two cultures are no longer correspondent. Below me was a fair sampling of the region's peasantry. It had not been dramatically destroyed, not smitten with a sword, but it was surely witnessing its own slow and ruinous depletion. In those people the sap was drying, the seed withering. As they moved about beneath the insulating, isolating twang of the swingster's steel guitar, the sense one got was of lethargy and defeat, of apathy, not tragedy. The compelling, if sometimes wicked, grandeur of Sutpen and Sartoris was past, a grandeur of myth, of fictive or historical dream. There is little of it left in the present-day South. One would have had a hard time finding in that crowd the kind of faces that Walker Evans and Dorothea Lange photographed 3 decades ago, when our peasantry was enduring a harsher and more tragic trial. The faces below looked softer and less sharp, and the hard, austere grace had mostly eroded away. As I was bringing these gloomy speculations into focus, something good finally happened on the platform. A young man named Johnny Grimble came on stage with his quartet. They were 4 good-natured local boys in khakis, and they didn't have a voltage-powered instrument of any kind. Apparently, they had already tuned up, because they lit right into a song called Rubber Dolly. If they had had nothing but their energy, they would still have been better than any group I had heard that day. But besides energy, they had the sense to sing songs that meant something to them, and they were not too citified to swing their elbows and pat their feet. When Rubber Dolly was over, the leader stepped to the microphone and sang a ballad with sex in it. One line was repeated over and over. She called me baby, baby, all night long. He had no great skill, nor great concern with skill, but he had passion enough to transform a corny song and make it seem true. When he switched to Have I Told You Lately That I Love You, the crowd responded to what was genuine and got quiet. The sun had dropped behind the courthouse. For the first time that day, I felt I was hearing music that expressed the people around the platform, though more probably it was Johnny Grimble who expressed them. When he stepped back from the microphone, the group swang into Under the Double Eagle. I hoped that morning policeman was still around. When the Grimble boys stepped down, things deteriorated rapidly, back to the level of the swingsters. The next 2 bands had so many steel guitars that my ears began to ring, and I left the platform. It seemed a good time to see what breed of men and women had come in for the street dancing. Certainly East Texas womanhood was showing me its painful worst. All day I had not noticed a pretty woman around the bandstand, nor could I spot one in the evening crowd. A few were of the long-legged, gawky variety, but the majority were short, straggle-haired farm women with dumpy breasts, thin legs, and fat behinds. There were a lot of town women around, but except for stiff, permanent waves and more makeup, they looked like the country women. While I was walking through the crowd, they turned on the yellow bulbs that had been strung above the street to light the dancing. Their strong, almost urinous glare contracted with the soft dusk and gave colors of grotesquerie to the whole assemblage. A bunch of flabby-armed, hugely pregnant women stood by the curb, talking about their pregnancies. There was a concession stand, and a little booth next to it where they sold cotton candy and pennants and monkeys on strings, foam rubber dice to dangle from rear-view mirrors, raccoon tails and Confederate flags. Passing the booth, I saw a little barefooted, sandy-haired East Texas boy in overalls, standing with his obviously stone-broke, whiskey-breathed father. The little boy was staring with his whole being at one of the cheap telescopes on sale for $1.98. The purity of his want was too much to look upon. When the man beckoned, the boy followed, but one felt that for years part of him would remain right there, wanting that telescope. Part of me has remained there, too, for the moment hangs in my mind, a glimpse of the beginnings of destruction, his or mine or everyone's, in that real and terrible hunger for a trivial thing. The older boys in the crowd cheered me somewhat. They were hungry for sex and were clustered around the teenage girls. Then I went into the courthouse to get a drink of water and ran into a family of idiots. I had been seeing one of them all day, a taciturn boy-man with a concave face and receded nose. One could have laid a rule from forehead to chin without touching either his lips or his nose. Suddenly, grouped on the steps like freaks from the old Todd Browning movie, were 4 more like him, one of them an old lady and one a pregnant girl who looked no older than 14. The crowd just wasn't working out for me. On the platform, a group called the Western All-Stars was having its try. They sported a female vocalist, a small, thin-legged girl in a grimy-looking black skirt and a tasseled blouse. "I'm driftin' into deep water," she sang, a faint Kitty Wells timbre in her voice. The folk listened in silence, or were they the folk? Once the concept of folk carried with it an implicit relation to the soil. The folk lived on and worked the land. Now they are drifting, surely, but not toward deeper waters, toward the same suburbs and television swamps in which the cowboys were bogged. That day I had driven from Fort Worth to Dallas, through Dallas, and on to Athens. Of the 100 miles I traveled, 50 had been suburbia. I had driven along the new Stemmons Freeway and got the commuter's view of the Big D skyline, with the bright tin can facades of the skyscrapers flashing in the morning sun. They tapered upward, at that time, to the ultimate southwestern phallus, the shaft with the light in its head above the Republic National Bank. The flying red horse that had once reared unchallenged above all Texas was far below. I drove up Commerce Street, so aptly named, past Neiman Marcus, its Ne-Plus produce and ultra customers beautifully juxtaposed to the beer joints, wine bars, and shoeshine parlors of South Hervé. I drove out 2nd Avenue past the fairgrounds, a Goodwill store, a DAV store, 20 second-hand furniture stores, numerous used car lots, a Negro picture show, 2 junk auto yards, 40 hamburger stands, and the Kaufman Pike Drive-In. Behind me was where the folk had drifted, to Neiman's and 2nd Avenue, South Hervé and the Stemmons Freeway, and the 30 miles of cotton patch suburbia between Fort Worth and Dallas. It was little wonder that the farms around Athens had a wilting look, even though the grass was green and the air of spring. The last band I heard that night was the Twilight Serenaders, a group unique in 2 respects. First, in regard to instrumentation, they were far and away the most elaborately equipped group to appear, with over a dozen pieces and everything electric but the fiddle. Second, and more remarkable, they had for a vocalist the one really lovely woman I saw that day. She came on stage with her daughter, who was to accompany her. They sat just beyond the judges at my end of the stage. She was to sing only one song, and sat very quietly, her hands folded in her lap, during the long half-hour it took the serenaders to get their 12 instruments plugged in and tuned. I watched her from amid the empty instrument cases. She was in her early 40s, still shapely and high-breasted, a calm, graceful, brown-haired woman. All day I had watched graceless bodies and resigned faces, but her face was not resigned, merely sorrowful. Her name was Obera Waters. Though she sat with a quiet, pleasant look on her face, what one noticed most in her was a combination of melancholy and weariness, the tired, composed weariness of someone who has lived a long while in the love of people whose capacities were smaller than her own. When Mrs. Waters stood up to sing, I noticed that she was missing 2 lower front teeth. She sang standing in the shadows and sat back down. One of the musicians came over and squatted by me for a minute. He put up his electric banjo and took out an electric mandolin. Underneath the instrument was a little sheaf of song lyrics typed on variety store tablet paper and held together with a paper clip. The song on top was "I Am Weak, But Thou Art Strong," a song that simply begs for a mandolin accompaniment. He plugged in the mandolin, and the serenaders began their elaborate tune-up, only this time it was too elaborate. The strain of all those instruments was finally too much for the circuits, and several fuses blew. The serenaders were reduced to a few discordant tinkles. It took them 20 minutes to get the fuses replaced, and in the interim I learned that Texas Shorty was up next, with Red Rogers in the wings. The street dance seemed suddenly not worth waiting for, and I left. When I walked off the platform, Mrs. Waters still sat calmly in the chair, her hands folded again, and her face still lovely and tired. In less than an hour, I was back on 2nd Avenue. I crossed Dallas and stopped for a cheeseburger at a little beer joint near the Circle. Sitting next to me at the counter was a good-natured guy in a green Dr. Pepper Bottling Company uniform. He was a baseball fan and lacked several more teeth than Mrs. Waters. A girl called to him from a booth, and he grabbed his 2 bottles of Pearl and left. If Dallas is good for nothing else, it is a useful divider. I had been in the South all day, but as I turned toward Fort Worth, I re-entered the West, for me always a good feeling. Ahead, north to Canada and west to the coast, lay what to me is the most exciting stretch of land in America. Despite its rudeness, newness, rawness, it is not worn out, not yet filled, not yet exhausted. If one loves the West, it is sometimes deeply moving to drive along one of its rims and sense the great spread of country that lies before one: West Texas, New Mexico and Colorado, Wyoming, the Dakotas, Utah, Arizona, Montana, and Idaho, Nevada, Oregon, and Washington, and the long trough of California, with the names of rivers and cities and highways now binding the land like old trails which once led to Oregon or Santa Fe. Now it is Highway 40 and Highway 80 and Highway 66 that lead one from the Mississippi to the Pacific, to Cheyenne or to Denver, to Phoenix, El Paso, Los Angeles, or San Francisco. On the rims of the West, and perhaps in America only there, one can still know for a moment the frontier emotion, the loneliness and the excitement, and the sense of an openness so vast that it still challenges, in Gatsbyan phrase, our capacity for wonder. I can summon no wonder for what lies between Dallas and Washington. The South is memories, memories. It cannot help believing that yesterday was better than tomorrow can possibly be. Some of the memories are extraordinarily well packaged, it is true, but when a place has been reduced in its own estimation, no amount of artful packaging can hide the gloom. I hope Mr. Clarence stays out there in West Los Angeles. His description of Athens, Texas, struck me as very apt. And when I think of Obera Waters, who is left there still, it is as a rare and weary reminder of a people's departing grace. Love, Death, and the Astrodome. Number 7. A version of the previous chapter was published some years ago in the Texas Quarterly, a publication edited in Austin by the ghost of William Lyon Phelps. A number of correspondents suggested that I was no fit appreciator of East Texas pastoralism, and probably they were right. A version of this chapter was published some years ago in the Texas Observer, a publication also edited in Austin, I assume by wraiths and elves. A number of correspondents suggested that I had been frivolous and presumptuous to speak so disparagingly of the Dome, and probably they too are right. As it happens, frivolity and presumptuousness are qualities the Texas literary scene has always lacked. I merely thought to remedy that lack, and the Dome provided a compelling occasion. The first promising rumor I heard about the Harris County domed stadium was that it was going to be large enough that the Shamrock Hotel could be put inside it. Great, I thought, assuming naturally that the powers that be would take advantage of such an opportunity. At last a real solution to the Shamrock problem seemed to lie at hand. $45 million is a respectable sum, but who would cavil if it got that hotel out of sight? A year or so later, with sinking heart, I realized that the Dome builders had somehow missed the mark. The Shamrock continued to blot out a considerable portion of Houston's southern horizon, while a short distance away, the huge white dome poked soothingly above the summer heat haze, like the working end of a gigantic roll-on deodorant. Form, I supposed, was following function. We needed a dome, so Houston's sports fans wouldn't get so damp and sweaty. It seemed neither wise nor fair. The weather in Houston is certainly oppressive, but then sports fans probably deserve and perhaps even require the bad weather they get. Braving frostbite and sunstroke helps keep their sadistic and masochistic tendencies in balance. Increasing their comfort might only make them meaner. Besides, pallid though the argument may appear, it seemed a bit conscienceless for a city with leprous slums, an inadequate charity hospital, wretched public transportation, and numerous other cultural and humanitarian deficiencies, to sink more than $31 million in public funds into a ballpark. It was not, however, surprising. Houston is the kind of boom town that will endorse any amount of municipal vulgarity, so long as it has a chance of making money. Building hereabouts has traditionally been a form of stealing, and however questionable the motive, it does ensure that all sorts of public marvels get built. At any rate, though the world may by now have forgotten the occasion, the Astrodome did open in the spring of 1965. The president attended the opening game, as did a constellation of lesser celebrities, and one could make a wicked little anthology of the things famous people had to say about the place. For a time in Houston, the Astrodome was not just news, it was the only news. Texas was generally agog, and Dallas was feverish with civic envy. The letters columns of the Dallas Morning News were soon clogged with plaintive little epistles telling the editors how much better life would be if only Dallas had a dome. For a time, there was even a move afoot to dome the Cotton Bowl. I was somewhat slow in getting to the dome myself. Summer rolled around, and the fact that I still hadn't been was leaving me more and more disadvantaged in conversations. I was somewhat slow in getting to the dome myself. Summer rolled around, and the fact that I still hadn't been was leaving me more and more disadvantaged in conversations. It was like not having read McLuhan. You simply have to see it to believe it, I was frequently told. Finally, I went, and 5 minutes after I walked inside, I knew I could have believed it perfectly well without ever going near it. From the parking lot on, it was echt Texas. By the time I came to this realization, however, I was 4 levels above the field, on a fast escalator, surrounded by a convention of national press photographers, their rolets, and their wives. Our tour guide, a pleasant, intelligent young lady, shepherded us out into what is called the upper stands, and allowed us to sit down a few minutes and adjust to the altitude. By sitting us down until we had sort of come to terms with the size of the dome, most of us escaped the brief, sometimes unpleasant sense of disorientation that often afflicts visitors when they first enter. Even sitting down, I felt a little bit uncomfortable, and my trouble was not vertigo, though vertigo did cause one lady in the party to hurry back to the ramps. Far below us, the Astros were taking batting practice, and while I could see the balls being hit, I was too high up to hear the crack of the bat. The cause of my first discomfort, I think, was that the vast amount of physical space in the dome is somehow out of proportion with the amount of psychological space. In that sense, it is indeed echt Texas. Some levels of the stadium are about as psychologically roomy as a sardine can. Fortunately, the dome itself is a clean, impressive piece of engineering, and does much to alleviate the sense of suffocation that can come on one in the clubs and restaurants. At this time, the dome still had its original grass, though much of it had already died and been painted a strange, ungrassy green. There was a stretch in deep center field that looked as arid as the range along the Pecos. And a week before my visit, the circus had trampled the infield into a green-tinted dirt. I am told it was an odd feeling to watch a circus in which the aerialists were 100 feet below one. When I had seen the Sky Blazer restaurant, the Countdown cafeteria, and the Astrodome Club, I quit the tour and drifted down 5 or 6 levels to the Domskeller, where I refreshed myself with a poor boy sandwich. The Domskeller was like something in a baseball stadium, a place where one could buy a hot dog and a beer and sit and watch the game. The management so clearly regarded it as a plebeian eatery that they hadn't bothered to fix it up much, whereas the other places are so fixed up they leave one gasping for breath. The one great disadvantage to the Domskeller is that you can't see the scoreboard from it. You can see the game fine, for what that's worth, but if someone should hit a home run while you were down there, you would miss the moment of supreme electronic ecstasy for which everyone waits. There you would be, stuck with a poor boy sandwich while 30 or 40,000 people were experiencing a neon orgasm. Little wonder the place is empty most of the time. My ticket entitled me to a red seat, the best that commoners can aspire to. I found the seat and whiled away the hour until game time by perusing a compendium called Inside the Astrodome. Reading it made me feel a little like Jonah probably felt when he was inside the whale. The book contained a letter from the president, another from the governor, a quote from Coleridge, guess which, a detailed comparison of the Astrodome and the Roman Colosseum, and page after page of staggering statistics. The stadium's ice plant, for example, can produce 36,000 pounds of ice a day. No one in this climate can fail to be impressed with such a figure. The handbook also had a list of the 53 individually styled skyboxes which rim the top of the dome, and which cost between $18,000 and $32,000 a season. There was the River Shannon, the Ramayana, and so on around the globe. After the game got underway, I counted the boxes with people in them and found that only 20 of the 53 were occupied. The man sitting next to me, a hearty, bearish fellow, didn't allow me to get any wrong ideas about the skyboxes, though. According to him, the people who owned the other 33 were inside in the private apartments that go with each box, disporting themselves on the astro couches, or astro beds, and watching the game on closed-circuit TV. "Yeah, that's where they are," the man said, yanking at his tie. He seemed like the sort of man who didn't wear a tie to work, but had put one on especially to come to the Astrodome. The thought that some wealthy lady might be copulating in a skybox clearly preyed on his mind. I took his comment with a large grain of salt. The Texas middle class has always overestimated the sexuality of the Texas rich. Not many of the local rich would be inclined to make love at a ball game, even if they could manage it at that altitude. Later, I learned that what they really do in the skyboxes is watch Peyton Place. The game that evening was between the Astros and the Mets, and it was obvious from the first pitch that most of the fans would not have bothered to sit through such a limp contest had it been taking place anywhere else. Even in the Dome, many of them might have left the game had it not been for the big electronic screen in center field. The game's true function was to provide material for the man who operated the screen. Whenever the Mets got a runner as far as second base, the screen showed a foolhardy Met being smashed into the dust by a plummeting Astro, after which the word "Whoa" appeared, and the fans yelled "Whoa." Usually this was sufficient to stop the Mets cold. Later in the game, when the Astros unleashed the full fury of their normally inconspicuous attack, the screen assisted them on practically every pitch. When an Astro got on base, there was a blast of heraldic trumpets, and a little cavalryman, Teddy Roosevelt, thundered across the screen, saber raised. The word "Charge" appeared, and the fans yelled, "Charge!" Sometimes, instead of the cavalryman, a fierce little black bull came on and dashed about. When an Astro performed some particularly daring feat of base running, like not quite getting picked off, the screen flashed "Olé!" and the fans yelled "Olé!" If the Astros push across 2 or 3 runs in one inning, the trumpets and the charges and the bull and the cavalryman have the crowd in such a state of frenzy that the one thing they want to do is yell "Charge" again. It is fascinating to ponder the possible uses to which screen and scoreboard might be put. Billy Graham, for instance, finds the Dome a good place to crusade. But would a conversion be the equivalent of a home run or a single? When would one yell charge? Or if the Dome were to be used for some social sport, like a political convention, wouldn't the man who controlled the screen control the convention? On reflection, the comparison between the Dome and the Colosseum became a little disturbing. What but blood sport could ever be really violent enough for the Dome? When a gladiator fell, a huge thumb, turned down, of course, could be flashed on the screen, followed by the words, "Hook 'em, horns!" Texas fans could yell that with real enthusiasm. After a while, I got up and wandered back into the upper stands to see how the game looked from there. Two old ladies sat just below me, one of them so armored with diamonds that she looked like some kind of eccentric crustacean. She ignored the game and kept her field glasses trained on one of the skyboxes. I gathered from the conversation that she owned the skybox, but had gone into temporary exile in the upper stands because her family had insisted on inviting guests she couldn't stand. She watched indignantly as the obnoxious someone made free with her liquor, and now and again, when the trumpets blared their command, she and her companion turned dutifully around and yelled, "Charge!" By the seventh inning, the screen had practically destroyed my will. Every time the trumpets sounded, I felt the word "charge" forming on my lips. I got up and left, but after 3 hours in the Dome, my sense of direction was in no better shape than my will, and I exited on the north side of the stadium almost a mile from my car. At night, from the outside, the Dome looks very good, with the lights glowing through the roof and the white serrated walls. I walked through the parking lot, down rows and rows and rows of cars, and after a while it dawned on me that all the cars were new, or nearly so. The parking lot was like a factory yard in Detroit. There was not a jalopy anywhere, just hundreds and hundreds of bright rectangular rear ends, with now and then a fishtail for variety. An affluent society indeed. There were no kids outside the park, just cops and parking attendants, and I had a moment of nostalgia for the baseball I had watched as an adolescent in good old Sputter Park when Wichita Falls had a Class B franchise. If one got tired of seeing the Spudders get walloped, it was only necessary to step outside the park to find some action. The grounds were alive with kids, Mexican, Negro, city kids, farm kids, all waiting hopefully for home run balls or out-of-the-park foul tips. When one came over, there was a scramble, and one grand night, when the Spudders got walloped 30-1, our local 9 garnered no less than 17 practice balls. If no balls came over, the kids stood around under the liquid North Texas sky and swapped dirty jokes and bits of sexual folklore, a form of cultural exchange that benefited us all. I found my car with difficulty and drove away. It was clear then, and is clearer now, that the Astrodome would be an immense success, if for no other reason than that it itself is immense. Though it is a very pleasant place to watch a sports event, it is much more the product of a love of money and ostentation than of a love of sport. It caters quite successfully to what is least imaginative in the national character. Judge Roy Hofheinz, who masterminded the Dome, now intends to surround it with an $18 million amusement park and 14 or 15 million worth of motels. And these, too, I imagine, will be immense successes, for his customers have more appetite for circuses than they now have for bread. The judge, by the way, is also echt Texas. Those desiring elaboration are referred to page 54 of You Be the Judge, written by his daughter, Deanie Hofheinz Mann. That page is a touchstone of a sort. A day or two after my visit to the Dome, I heard that Boston was going to build one bigger than Houston's, and with a retractable roof besides. Atlanta has one in the offing, and no doubt others will follow. Yet the prospect of being one-upped seems not to have agitated our civic bosom. Why should it? In Texas there is always room for something bigger. Soon some enterprising native will think of something new and even more extraordinary that Houston needs. Perhaps it will be a glassed-in aerial roadway from River Oaks to the Petroleum Club, or a mink beetle wig to put over the Dome on cold days. Whatever it is will be bigger, better, sexier, more violent, and above all, costlier than anything we've had before. Houston is that kind of town. A Handful of Roses, number 8. The cities of Texas indeed are that kind of cities, and it is not a point that need surprise anyone. The Anglos have only been in Texas about 150 years, scarcely time enough for civilization to have had an appreciable spread. The Texans' primary concerns have been survival and exploitation. For the amenities there has been, until lately, little time to spare. As late as 1930, the state was still two-thirds rural. With the exception of San Antonio, our cities are all adolescent, and it is not surprising that they should seize the most obvious and most accessible symbols of prestige. Ripeness we simply do not have, nor do we value it much. The Texan may prefer his politicians a little oozy, but he likes his women green and his cities as raw as possible, so as to allow free play to what's left of the frontier spirit. We are no longer so rustic, however, as to be above image polishing. Size and cost may continue to be our primary considerations, but you won't hear us admitting it. Texans have finally learned that bragging is a form of discourse they can no longer afford. The sophisticated modern Texan will not admit to size consciousness, or indeed to much of anything else. The old, loud, vulgar, groin-scratching Texan is rapidly giving way to a quieter sort of citizen, one who knows how to live with his itch. The new Texan tries for all he's worth, and frequently with all he's worth, to be as urbane as anybody else. The difficulty is that a genuinely urban manner cannot be acquired in a day, or even perhaps in a generation, and that's as long as most Texans have been working at it. Now that air travel has made it relatively easy to get in and out of Texas, one tends to forget how interminable the state once seemed. Size and distance impressed themselves on visitors and native alike as something definitive. An English friend once told me that until he crossed Texas by car, he had no real grasp of the concept of infinitude. We are no longer the prisoners of distance, but I think it will be a while yet before we free ourselves of attitudes formed in the days when we were creatures of the lonely plain and knew nothing of streets and subdivisions. A just characterization of our cities must take account of the fact that many of the people in them, and most of the people who control them, remain, like Professor Webb, symbolic frontiersmen. Wheeler-dealerism is an extension of the frontier ethos, refined and transplanted to an urban context. And while only a few of us are wheeler-dealers, most of us practice symbolic frontiersmanship in some form or fashion. I do, of course, want to be just to our cities. In Texas, the civic skin is very tender, and on the few occasions when I have happened to prick it in the past, indignant readers have hastened to remind me that there are plenty of cities in America just as imperfect as Houston and Dallas. There are even, I am told, cities whose imperfections closely resemble those of Houston and Dallas, and I am quite prepared to believe that my readers are right. There probably are cities as tense as Dallas, as crass as Houston, as shallow as Austin. I don't doubt it. In all likelihood, I have been in some of them. What I cannot imagine is why the existence of such imperfect cities should discourage me from writing frankly of Houston and Dallas. The assumption seems to be that because Pittsburgh is bad, Dallas should be spared all criticism. The implication that assumption but poorly conceals is that it is ungentlemanly to criticize home folks when one could be criticizing outsiders. Where the failings of home folk are concerned, a certain reticence is considered seemly. Fortunately, such an attitude need not restrain us here. I would like to consider 3 cities only, Houston, Dallas, and Austin. For Texas, they are quite clearly the style changers, the cities which exert the strongest suction on the surrounding land. They are the maternity wards of urban Texas. Most of the other cities in the state are really only populous towns. One could live a lifetime in them and remain a country person. The pressures in Dallas and Houston can destroy, or at least radically alter, a rural orientation within a very few years. San Antonio, of course, is a city. It is of Texas, and yet it transcends Texas in some way, as San Francisco transcends California, as New Orleans transcends Louisiana. Houston and Dallas express Texas. San Antonio speaks for itself, and much of its charm is in the way it embodies its past. Not a little of its charm, like that of El Paso, is attributable to the presence of Latins, who almost always improve an Anglo-Saxon town. For San Antonio's future, one has more fear than hope. Hemisphere may prove an annunciation such as Yeats foresaw in The Second Coming. The smaller cities are charming or not charming in direct proportion to their ratio of boosterism. Corpus Christi, El Paso, and Fort Worth are all low-booster towns, and are, in their various ways, pleasant. The state contains a number of rather esoteric communities, of which Midland is perhaps the best example. Midland is a new oil town, a community of some 70,000 nervous people, located many, many miles from anywhere, amid the desolate West Texas plain. A few years ago it was said to have more millionaires per subdivision than any community in the country. Its unpleasantness quotient is very high, so high, in fact, that I have never been able to get a satisfactory count on the millionaires. The few I have met were so conservative as to be practically paralytic in social situations. Next to rodeo cowboys, they are the least communicative breed of people I have yet encountered. Mr. Bainbridge, hardened, no doubt, by years in New York, endured Midland long enough to get a good sampling of anecdotes, and the curious are referred to him. For the other cities, Waco, Beaumont, the oil towns of East Texas, Lufkin, Longview, Tyler, Texarkana, and the triplets of the plains, Amarillo, Lubbock, Wichita Falls, generosity asks a kind silence. There are people who love each and every one of them, it would seem. Indeed, so many people have responded belligerently to my castigations of Wichita Falls that I am moved to retreat a step or two in its favor. I once had a character say that it was the ugliest place on earth, but since that time extensive readings in the literature of Patagonia, Siberia, and Central Asia have convinced me that, while dramatically apt, the statement should not be pressed as literally true. Ulaanbaatar, Omsk, Semipalatinsk, Tashkent, and some of the villages in the district of the Lop Nor, these are all at least as ugly, and doubtless the list will grow even longer as I read on. As I have already suggested, a quantity-quality confusion is something most Texans have come by naturally. The pioneer Texan could hardly help thinking of life in terms of quantities. Their descendants imbibed the concept of quantity with their mother's milk, had it fed into their vocabulary, and grew up to find it completely entangled with their sense of self. Best is the superlative Texans usually tack on to those things they can allow themselves to be sentimental about. That is, the best little woman, best damn horse, best little town, while biggest is reserved for a more serious category: biggest ranch, biggest fortune, biggest failure, biggest deal. Houston, our biggest city, thus falls naturally into the category of things to be taken seriously. It covers 440 square miles, has a population pushing 1.5 million, and houses, as I have noted already, the phenomenal Astrodome, the state's most popular secular temple. The dome, I think, may be the last great expression of the old vulgarity and of the cherished Texas belief that if only one has enough money, all fantasies are in reach. Money, like any other god, should be worshipped in a proper setting and with an appropriate ritual, and the dome provides both. If I have dwelt on it overmuch, it is because it is a near-perfect symbol of Houston, a city with great wealth, some beauty, great energy, and all sorts of youthful confidence. But, withal, a city that has not as yet had the imagination to match its money. Houston has been a boom town for 20 years or more, and so far as one can tell, the boom is still accelerating. Like Los Angeles, it remains a city with no proper center, but is a loosely assembled collection of suburbs, districts, neighborhoods, some extremely luxurious, some extremely squalid. If one lives in River Oaks or in similarly lavish parts of town, munificence and reality begin to seem coterminous, and the squalors of the ghettos must appear to be no more than a terrible civic hallucination, as Watts must appear to the average resident of Beverly Hills. To examine such a city definitively, one would have to fix an arbitrary center and move outward in narrow concentric circles until one reached the outermost shopping center or the last far-flung suburb, halfway to Galveston or a third of the way to Austin. Fortunately, I had nothing that definitive in mind. As I said, Houston is a boom town, and boom towns do not differ all that much. Houston, like most of them, is lively, open, and violent. The common goal is tomorrow's dollar. Civic corruption is part of the game and seldom draws more than a tolerant chuckle from the busy citizenry. The past yields to the present with a minimum of resistance. Indeed, unless the past can be sold, it is summarily kicked out of the way. Let high-rise apartments really catch on, and some imaginative entrepreneur will rent the San Jacinto Monument and have it converted by Christmas. The arts are stolidly but dutifully supported, and there is the usual self-congratulatory talk about what a cultural center we have raised on the once barren plain. The middle class are allowed to participate in the fantasies of the rich, a privilege they pay for eagerly, and the poor have the sufferings to which they are fairly accustomed, as the poet said. Here, as in Los Angeles, many of the brightest, best-informed citizens have no roots in, interest in, or commitment to the community. If we have an equivalent to the movie industry, it is the oil business, whose leading lights once got almost as much publicity as movie stars. Once, but no more. It is pretty clear that the day of the millionaire eccentric is over in Texas. Our younger rich do their absolute best to behave like members of the middle class, and a great many of them succeed. The old were less self-conscious. Not long ago, in front of the Warwick Hotel, Houston's little acre of Beverly Hills, I actually heard a very wealthy, 60-ish lady order her chauffeur to pull her Cadillac alongside an acquaintance's Chrysler, so she could be sure her car was longer. The chauffeur did as commanded, and the lady, secure in her standards, surveyed the two vehicles with a critical eye, and when she was satisfied, waved the driver on.